This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Sarah, good morning. And to the rest of the world, good morning or good evening, wherever you might be.
Good day.
Good day. Oh, that's very technically correct. What we have this morning, is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. That is I. I am the voice of Respectonomics, joined with my co-host, Sarah Benton. And what we're going to be doing this morning is part of the Compass Point series. And we have been dividing out the necessities of existence for a human being. And we've talked about food, and we've talked about light, and we've talked about hope. Today, we're going to be talking about oxygen. That the human body needs oxygen to exist, period.
Correct.
And I would like to back this up a little further by saying, of all the things we've talked about, this discussion on oxygen is probably the most important. It's important humanly, and you might say, well, that's pretty straightforward. But from a business point of view, the metaphor or the reality of oxygen is extremely important. And I'm hoping that listeners will either listen for themselves humanly, or they will pass this on and around their business colleagues, because there's some very, very important dynamics involved in this.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So starting off with oxygen at a personal level, we know that everybody needs oxygen to live. We breathe it in the air. The air is actually 21% oxygen. The rest is pretty much nitrogen. And here's the key to oxygen. If I turn my oxygen supply off, I'm good for what, 2 minutes? Not very long. All of the other issues or the components of existence, food, shelter, light, those ones we can delay them, we can put them off, we can come back to them later and so on. But oxygen you cannot. It is spontaneous, it's reflexive, and it's absolutely essential. And this is a critical point because we know that in our human lives, the importance of oxygen, although candidly, most of us take it for granted. But beyond the taking it for granted, anybody who's ever been finding themselves without oxygen knows that it's a crippling problem. And not only is it crippling, but the damage that comes from a shortened or reduced oxygen supply can be extraordinary. And there's one other aspect before we go to some other dynamics of the human oxygen. One of the things is we talk a lot about what I call clean oxygen. We talk about oxygen that is, the air is clean. And I think all of us are aware of the contaminants that can come into our breathing that can do extraordinary damage. If you talk to the Anti-Smoking League, they will explain how the smoke that one inhales into one's lungs is extraordinarily damaging and dangerous. That's just one example. But anybody who works in a chemical factory or some such, the necessities of keeping the air clean are extraordinary. So I want to talk, though, about our normal intake of oxygen as human beings. And there are one or two things to mention or to talk about. Sarah, one of the things that you're particularly familiar with is the aerobic process, which is the one that when we engage in aerobic exercise, we increase the intake of oxygen, which refreshes the body. But not only does it refresh the body, but it also refreshes the mind.
Yes.
We've used this line before. You know how you love you know how you want your Latin. I can hear you say,
Always,
come on, bring it on,
every day.
bring it on. Yeah. But mens sane corpore sano, a healthy body and a healthy mind. They go together. So the aerobic process is very, very important. And the rough point is 4 times a week, get your heart rate up for 40 minutes at the time, I think. I forget the exact details, but I think most of us are aware of the importance of aerobically getting the system going.
Right.
We talk about air quality. We've talked a bit about that. We've talked about how the quality of the air is so important to to not only to our physical state, but to our mental state. And I'm also going to stretch the elastic band and say, probably it's important to our character, our inner being, to our spirit or soul. I don't think we can disentangle aerobics from the rest of our total being.
Right.
Do you have any comment on that? Because then I'm going to move to another point.
No, I think we are all on the same page.
Same page so far. Okay.
Yeah.
But what I would like to talk about now is that when we talk about oxygen, and you've heard that line about taking a deep breath, you've heard that many a time. Well, in actual fact, there's another truth that we all ought to be aware of, and that is the deepest breath you can take is in fact the counterpoint to exhaling. In other words, rather than taking a deep breath, one of the great exercises is to exhale. And I mean, you literally force the air out of your lungs. And you do it 2 or 3 times. I'll do it now once just to show you what I'm doing it, which is to go, to let the air out. The reason you do that is because reflexively your body then says, we need to replace that exhaled air with new air, with fresh
Right.
air. And then you get fresh air circulating into your body. But also, when you've exhaled, the stale air has been removed. If you talk to anybody who's in a choir or is involved in singing or speaking, those kinds of, they talk about all these diaphragm exercises. And basically they are to do with allowing your oxygen to go to the depths of one's being.
Okay.
So we've got that. And you may say, well, that's all very well, humanly. Let's now translate this into the corporate metaphor. And I'm not even sure it's a metaphor. I think it's actually probably more pragmatic, more real than we've ever talked about. Our producer doesn't know this, but in actual fact, he will be asked to create 2 new domains. One is going to be called COPD, which I think most of us are horrifically aware of. That's when the the body cannot process the oxygen and other things go with it. But we're not going to call it chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We're going to call it corporate obstructive pulmonary disease, because the damage that is within a corporation when it doesn't breathe properly is extraordinary. And the other one is, you've heard of that expression, carbon dioxide?
Yes.
The stuff you exhale, the stuff that we generally think is nasty. The truth of the matter is, we're going to call that corporate dioxide, because if we're feeding people with dioxide, we are not giving them full oxygen. And if you're not getting full oxygen, every textbook will tell you about the dizziness, the lack of focus, in fact, the sort of stepping stone into a death spiral. So in other words, oxygenating a corporation is essential. And not only is it essential, I'll push the envelope one little further. The word corporation, again from Latin, is corpus, as in a body. So in other words, oxygenating us humanly must be every bit as important as oxygenating a corporation. If we're going to oxygenate the corporations, businesses, politicians, governments, and so on, they are brilliant at telling us about their systems of communications. They tell us how they have, seminars, and they have emails, and they have all these connecting points.
Right.
And that's fair enough. But if I look at my human body, I can have all these tracts in my body, these ducts, these channels and vessels, and whatever they are in my body working perfectly. But if the oxygen isn't good, that's all for naught. It's not going to help.
Right.
So in other words, it's the quality of the oxygen that goes into communication that is so important. And the quality of the information needs to adopt to 2 or 3 standards. It's the quality of information that we're pushing through the communication channels that is essential for a company to be able to breathe successfully. And the oxygen that we're talking about is information. And I think it's worth spending 2 seconds on what do we mean by quality of information. And I think one of the things is to tell the truth. The corporations and governments generally are very good at what I would commonly call a dissimulation, a sort of, you may not be able to see it, but we do. One of the things about oxygen is it's the same air that we all breathe. In fact, it's the heart of democracy to say that we all breathe the same oxygen. And if that is true, then that same oxygen, that same truth needs to pervade the entire corporation. And I think that this business of secrecy and silos and keeping things to oneself is one example of really, really contaminated oxygen. It is not getting through properly. And if it's not getting through properly at one level, I'll ask one question. How do we know if the oxygen's working at another level?
Right.
You have no level of assurance. So, getting the truth out, making sure that it's ubiquitous, that it's democratic, that it's getting out to everybody. So, whether we're talking at the board level or whether we're talking at the level, literally at the, should we call it, the shop floor,
Mhm.
which I have a real problem of even discussing the two as separate entities. What is more important to a corporation than the front line? The front line is where the public engages with the corporation. That is the most important connecting point. So let's not try and pretend that one area of a business is more important than the other. It's like one's own body. Each part is essential to the other parts. And as we recognize that, I want the oxygen in my body to go to my hand and my feet and my ears and all around me. And the same applies to the corporation. The oxygen needs to be the truth. The oxygen needs to go everywhere. And as we've said, the oxygen is a process of democracy. It is for everybody. And
Right.
here's another point about oxygen. When a company breathes in bad oxygen, the fact is it contaminates. And when it contaminates, when we hear about this business today of called quiet cracking, where people just don't feel they're up to the job and they don't really feel like it, they're not motivated, I suspect one of the reasons is that aerobically speaking, they're not getting good oxygen.
Mm.
And if you're not getting good oxygen, you're not going to be able to perform properly.
Right.
So I think there's a huge issue here of allowing or encouraging good information, good connections. We talk about information and communications. I think there's two other areas that are very important corporately. One of them is to draw alongside people. Nothing is more encouraging, nothing is more warming than having another human being warming up to you and coming alongside. That is
Right.
not judgmental. It's not even directing. It is just quite literally a case of drawing alongside. I think that is part of the oxygenating process. And if you think about it, if the oxygen is bad, then the person drawing alongside you is going to experience the same bad oxygen. On the other hand, if the oxygen is good, then we've got a way of saying to the other person, hey, take a deep breath or exhale and then take a deep breath, but it's really good oxygen. Here's the truth about what the company is doing.
Right.
The second thing, though, is if we agree that we're taking in these deep breaths, that is the internal arrangement within the corporation. So a corporation internally takes in deep breaths, correct? And it believes in good oxygen. We've got that straight. But every human being needs to exhale.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot overly inhale. You can, but eventually your body says, excuse me, and you have to exhale. And the corporation needs to be able to exhale. And what a corporation exhales is, in fact, what the public sees. It's what the public is engaging with. And that is when you see a company's reputation, you see its sense of responsibility, and you see its sense of reliability all coming to the table. So the quality of the oxygen inside the corporation is then reflected in the exhaling into the market. And the market, as I say, defines the company's success in terms of reliability, responsibility, as well as in reputation. There's not a single corporation that I'm aware of that would ever deny the benefits of reputation, responsibility, or reliability. The three of them go hand in hand. So, how we breathe in is how we also breathe out. The lungs need to work. We need to be aerobic. The corporation needs to be aerobic. The government needs to be aerobic. The politician needs to be aerobic. If you're going to breathe it in, make sure what you're breathing in is true and good, and be sure then that you exhale that same quality. The last thing I want to say about oxygen is this. I don't know if you know this or not. had to read a little more about it. But you can, in fact, get over-oxygenated. In other words, you kind of think, oh, well, if the air in the world is delivering 20%, what happens if I up the ante to 40 or 60% and take in all this fresh oxygen? Actually, the body can't do it. And in fact, there's a name for it, but you disease the body and the body can't handle it. Doesn't that sound remarkably familiar when a corporation shoves too much information in your face?
The thing that comes to my mind immediately as you were talking about that was filters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we need the filters. And I think when you think about that, when the company says or the politician says, yes, we've told everybody everything, and here it is. And it may be the truth, and it may be all good stuff. But if you overdo it, you are overdoing the body. We know that the body can't accommodate too much oxygen. Therefore, it also applies to the way that we live in relation to a business or into relation to a government.
Right.
In other words, they cannot push too much at us. I heard yesterday, I was at a meeting, and a speaker did not speak well. And I commented it on to somebody, and they said, oh, yes, that individual always puts in 150%. Meaning the 50% is too much, you can't hear it, and you can't absorb it. So if we're going to explain the corporations and the politicians' desire for oxygen, it rests on the idea that the oxygen is pure, the oxygen is good, the oxygen is free of contaminants, that the lungs are allowed to breathe. I want employees and, frankly, voters. I want people to be able to breathe, because when you suppress the breathing process, does it really matter how good the oxygen is if people aren't able to breathe?
Right.
So we need people to be able to breathe. We need to be very aware of this. And I think, frankly, of all of the messages that we have and discussions we've put out, I believe that this oxygen issue is probably the most important. Either you call it a metaphor or you call it a real paradigm to how corporations and governments need to coexist with their base.
Right. Their foundation, their employees, their front line, the inner workings, however you want to coin it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, may I?
You may.
I rest my case.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for being a champion of Respectonomics. When you share this message, you help multiply its reach and contribute to a stronger, more respectful life and business culture.